Good morning, Algebra kids. Let's go ahead and let's get started with a new lesson of a new chapter. Hopefully I got everyone's chapter 9 test grade in or test turned in, and I would expect those to be graded and sent back to you guys within the next 24 to 48 hours. So go ahead and just kind of expect those to be coming back your way if you are looking to see what you got on that test. With that being said, let's get started with lesson 1. Chapter 10, Pythagorean Theorem. So this entire lesson is derived around one formula, and that one formula is a pretty easy one to know, and it's one you definitely should have memorized whenever you hit high school next year. It's not one that you need to necessarily study over and over again. I think it's pretty simple, and that formula is this one right here in the middle of the page. A squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. And that formula works with any right triangle. So meaning it's got a right angle somewhere in that triangle. So again, right triangles are what works with Pythagorean theorem. Now, whenever we have a right triangle, again, a little refresher, they're usually labeled with this right angle symbol somewhere in one of the corners. And we label their sides as A, B, and C. And whenever we label those sides, they actually have names that are given for those sides. Sides A and B, those are legs. And side C, that is what we call the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse, a couple things about it. One, it's always across from the right angle. So notice how the right angle and the hypotenuse, they're almost like diagonal or adjacent from one another. They're just across from one another. Also, the hypotenuse, that is the longest side of any triangle. So the hypotenuse has to be longer than A and B. So if I were to say that leg A was 10 feet, leg B was 9 feet, well, that would mean leg C, or excuse me, the hypotenuse, C, it would have to be greater than 10, because it's got to be the longest side. It cannot be 10, it's got to be 10.1 or larger. So the hypotenuse is always going to be the longest side of your triangle. Again, here's your formula, and that's what we're going to be working with today. So let's get started with question number 1. So I give you a triangle here. We've got two legs that are labeled. Our first leg is 8 inches, second leg is 6 inches, and your hypotenuse, C. I want to find what is the hypotenuse. What's the dimensions for it? I'm going to plug this all in to my formula. Always write that formula down whenever you're trying to solve. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And now I'm going to start to plug these in. Guys, it doesn't matter if 8 happens to be A or if 8 is B. Same thing with 6. 6 could be A or it could be B. And that's because A and B, they're both legs. So they can be kind of intertwined, interchanged here. I'm going to go ahead and just label 8 as A. So I'm going to have 8 squared plus 6 squared. And that's equal to c squared. And I'm not sure what c is because I'm not given c, and that's the whole point of this problem. And now I'm going to go through and solve. 8 squared, every one of you should know, 8 squared is 64, plus 6 squared, everyone should know that one as well. 6 squared is 36. So now I'm going to add up 64 plus 36 to find out what c squared is equal to. Now, when you add 64 plus 36, you're going to get 100. Now, 100 is equal to c squared. I don't want to know what c squared is equal to. I want to know what c is equal to. So the last step of solving these problems is to get rid of the squared symbol. I need to get this down to just c. The way to get rid of a squared symbol is to take the square root. Those cancel one another out. So I need to take the square root of both sides. If you're unfamiliar with square roots, kind of a little refresher here, If I hit the second button on my calculator, and then I come down to x squared, notice how above x squared you got the square root symbol. So I can hit second, and then that square root symbol, type in 100, that's going to be equal to 10. So really just looking for what times itself is going to be equal to 100. So the square root of 100 is equal to 10. So 10 is equal to C. So C is equal to 10. That's my final answer. And that's really, guys, all this lesson is about. It's using that formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Let's do the same thing on number 2. Again, legs are 9 centimeters and 12 centimeters. Okay, what's your hypotenuse? Still going to use that same formula. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Plug your numbers in. 9 squared plus 12 squared is equal to c squared. You could have wrote 12 as your A and you could have wrote 9 as your B. Doesn't matter. 9 came first, so I'm just going to list it as A. 9 squared, 81. 12 squared is equal to 144 is equal to c squared. I'm going to add 81 to 144, and I get 225. Final step, take the square root. I need to get rid of the squared symbol. You take the square root of 225. That's going to be 15. 15 times 15 is equal to 225. So C is equal to 15. 15 is your hypotenuse. And notice, guys, on numbers 1 and 2 that we solved, the answer that we got for C, remember, your hypotenuse should be the longest side. Notice on numbers 1 and 2, C is in fact the longest measurement. 10 is longer than 8, which is also longer than 6. 15 is longer than 9, and it's also longer than 12. So we need to make sure that we're noticing that with our final answers. If your final answer is not the longest side and you're solving for the hypotenuse, then you did something wrong. Also, make sure you add your units. It should be 10 inches, and on number 2, should be 15 centimeters. And it's just straight up centimeters, no centimeters squared, no centimeters cubed, just centimeters. Let's look at number 3. Number 3 is a little bit different. On number 3, I've got the triangle drawn. And if you can notice from the diagram, you're missing A. You're missing one of the legs. So you have one leg, which is 5, and you have the hypotenuse. It's the longest side, and it's also across from the right angle. And your hypotenuse is 13 feet. I'm going to use the same formula to find what one of my legs is. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Plug it in. Now, with this problem, I have A as kind of that blank letter. Again, it doesn't really matter because your A and B, they're both legs. So if you want to put 5 here first, that's fine, and you would just solve for B squared. So let's plug everything in. So A squared, because I don't have A, plus 5 squared equals 13 squared. Your next step, we want to go ahead and we want to simplify now. So A squared is going to stay A squared, 5 squared, 25, equals 13 squared. 13 squared, if you're unsure, use your calculator. 13 squared, 169. All right, so we're solving for A squared. This now just becomes you're just solving for the one variable that you're missing. It's kind of like a one-step equation, except you just have to take the square root at the end of the problem. So let's get A squared by itself. And in order to do that, I'm going to subtract 25. So if you subtract 25, A squared is going to be equal to 144. Take the square root because I want just A, not A squared. And A is equal to 12. Because the square root of 144 is 12. 12 times 12 is 144. Let's look at number 4. Another problem very similar. This time, guys, we're given where it's b. And if I may, on 3, again, it'd be 12 feet. On number 4, so I have 12 as a leg. I have b as b. That's one of the legs as well. 15 is c. 15 is across from the right angle, so it's got to be the hypotenuse. So I know that b has to be a number smaller than 15. Let's go through and let's solve and find what b is. So I'm going to have a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I think it's a good idea to always write that formula down. A squared is equal to 12 squared plus b squared equals 15 squared. So go through, simplify it down. So 12 squared is 144 plus b squared, and that's equal to 225. Now I want to get b squared by itself, so I'm going to subtract 144. B squared is equal to 225 minus 144 equal to 81. Guys, the most common mistake on these problems is going to be you're going to get to this point here and you're going to stop. And you're going to do so because you're going to think you've already got the variable equal to a number. Or maybe you forgot to write the squared symbol, so you would say that b is equal to 81. Don't forget about your last step. I'm looking for b, not b squared. So I'm going to take the square root of b, and I'm also going to take the square root of 81. So b is equal to 9, and that's because 9 times 9 is 81. And on this problem, we don't have any units. We just know that it's equal to 9, and we would just say 9 units then. Let's go ahead and let's finish this off. We have just a couple more problems left on this lesson. Kind of a short one today. Kind of an easier lesson to get the week started. So number 5, I've got 6, 24, and 25, and these are all inches. And my question is, will it make a right triangle? So I'm given 3 separate lengths, and I want to know, will they make a right triangle? When I'm trying to find out if it'll make a right triangle, I'm going to still use the Pythagorean theorem. So I'm still going to use a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. I'm going to plug my numbers in. Now, there's one thing with this type of question that we have to be careful with. We have to make sure that we put in for c squared the biggest number, and that's because the hypotenuse, which is also c, is your greatest side length. Now, with this question, all of your numbers are actually in order from least to greatest, so it kind of makes it easy for us. So I'm going to plug them in. I just have to make sure that, again, c is the biggest. So I'm going to have 6 inches for a, so 6 squared plus 24 squared equals 25 squared. 25 being the biggest number, it's got to be c. Now we're going to go through and just solve. I'm going to simplify this down. So 6 squared is equal to 36 plus 24 squared, which is 576, which is equal to 25 squared, which is 625. Last step, I just want to simplify here. So I'm going to combine like terms here on the left. So I'm going to take 36 plus 576. And when I add those together, I get 612. If I continue this on, and I have 612 is equal to 625, I know off the bat 612 and 625 are not the same number. So these two would not be equal to one another. So that whenever you're asked, will these 3 measurements make a right triangle, the answer is no. And they will not because they're not equal to one another. The left side and the right side are not the same. Let's look at another example of this, number 6. So again, I've got 10 inches, 24 inches, and 26 inches. Just by looking at those numbers, you should already know 26 inches has to be c. So a squared plus b squared equals C squared, fill them in. 10 squared plus 24 squared equals 26 squared. Now let's go through and let's solve. 10 squared is equal to 100. 24 squared is equal to 576. And 26 squared is equal to 676. I add my left side by combining like terms. 676 is equal to 676. Yes, those two are equal to one another. Those two numbers are the same. So will those numbers create a right triangle? Absolutely. So just to kind of reference this, if you were to draw a right triangle, 26 inches would be the hypotenuse. 10 inches would be a leg, and 24 inches would also be the other leg. So that's what your right triangle would look like. The reason, guys, like on number 5, for example, this example would not work, and the reason mathematically why they are not equal to one another, if you were to draw this out and use the measurements, it'd almost be like, okay, there's your hypotenuse, there's the 25 inches, here's the 24 inches, and then there's the 6 inches. And as you can see, this triangle is not closed. There's a gap here. So if you were to draw this one, this is an example of maybe what that triangle would look like when you drew it if they're not equal to one another and the two sides don't make a right. The two sides are not equal. So there's a possibility of it having a gap, or there's a possibility of it, say this was my bottom. Maybe the bottom was way too long and it overshot the hypotenuse. Notice how it didn't come to all three of the vertex. The sides didn't stop. So this is just kind of an example of what those triangles would look like if you put all of the side lengths together and they weren't equal. They are equal, kind of like this picture here. It's going to come out to be a perfect triangle. All right, the last thing I want to get into, guys, with this lesson, and it's not in your book. I don't think you're going to see it on the quiz that you're probably about to take after this set of notes, but just in case you do, and so that you are mindful of this, something that goes along with the Pythagorean theorem is called the Pythagorean triple. And what that means is all sides of a right triangle are integers. So your examples here would be 3, 4, and 5. Well, if those were the three sides that you were given, 3, 4, and 5, you knew that 5 has to be the hypotenuse because it's the largest, and 3 and 4 were your two legs. Another example of a Pythagorean triple would be 6, 8, and 10, where 6 and 8 would be your two legs, and 10 would be the hypotenuse. And all of these examples, guys, are ones that are just like the right side here, where when you solve them, the left and the right side are both going to be equal. So another example would be 5, 12, and 13. And these examples, guys, go on and on and on forever. These are not the only three that there are. These are just kind of the more common ones. And this is the math behind it and why it makes sense. So a squared, b squared, c squared, 3 squared plus 4 squared is equal to 5 squared. So I have 9 plus 16 is equal to 25. 25 is equal to 25. So the fact that I have all three integers, no decimals, no fractions, and when I plug them in for a, b, and c, they're equal to one another, that creates a Pythagorean triple. Now, we saw a lot of Pythagorean triples throughout this lesson because we didn't deal with a lot of decimals and we didn't deal with a lot of fractions. So that's what a Pythagorean triple is and kind of what separates them from the rest. Now, if I were to, for example, we come down here to, I think we're on problem number 7. Say I were to draw the triangle out, and I were to tell you that, hey, the one leg was 3, the second leg was 7. I want you to find my c. Well, let's go through here and let's solve. So a squared, b squared, c squared, a squared, I have 3, so 3 squared, b squared is 7, equals c squared. 3 squared is equal to 9. 7 squared is 49, and that equals c squared. So if I add these two together, I'm going to get 58. 49 plus 9, 58. And that's equal to c squared. How do I get c by itself? I take the square root. Now notice, the square root of 58 is not a perfect square. I cannot take the square root of 58 and get an integer. If we come to our calculator over here and we take the square root of 58, I get this really long decimal. It doesn't come out to be an even number. So guys, it is possible that you're going to get a decimal as an answer to maybe a leg or a hypotenuse. Now, with this example, I would probably round this answer off at 7.6, and that's because the 1 would make the 6 stay where it's at. So C would be equal to 7.6. The majority of the Pythagorean theorem problems that you do as you get older are actually going to be more in terms of decimals, fractions, and on some of them you would actually leave them with just the radical, but that's a story for another day. So again, if you end up with a decimal, this was our first and only example of one, it's okay. And notice, we solved this problem the exact same. I typed in my calculator the way I saw it, and hey, I just ended up with a decimal answer instead of a whole number, okay? So again, it is possible. Don't freak out or stress out just because you get a decimal or a fraction for an answer. That's the Pythagorean theorem. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. You guys have done a good job for the most part reaching out if you had a problem with something or couldn't figure something out. I'm going to encourage you to do so. We only have about 2 more weeks left of school. Let's finish out this quarter strong. Thanks, guys.